I'd like for you to turn in your Bibles tonight to the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew. We're going to start there in verse 1. In our previous studies, we looked at the parables that Jesus had just shared with the priest there in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And we know as we studied that they understood what Jesus was saying. And I would concur that they did not like what they were hearing very much. And they certainly desired to get rid of Jesus. They were desirous to have Jesus dead. And we know that not too long after this occurrence, that they did take him before the Romans. And the Romans finally, after the pleading of the Jewish people, the priest, they took Jesus and crucified him on a cross. Now, as we move in to the 24th chapter of Matthew, as well as looking over in the parallels of this, we find that Jesus and the disciples have left Jerusalem and made their way to the Mount of Olives. But on that journey, Jesus' heart was torn. It was broken. And we looked back in Matthew 23 and verse 7. It says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather her children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are unwilling. Jesus desired the children of Israel to be faithful to God, accept him as the Messiah, which they did not, and to follow him into the future, into Christianity. You know, we saw as we talked about the last part of Daniel, how Daniel was weeping, how he was just torn up inside because the work on the temple had stopped. The temple is a preeminent thing in these people's minds and hearts, because it is in that temple where they give their sacrifice to God. It is in their temple where they approach God. It is, in essence, all put together. Their religious foundation, their anchor, if you will, was that temple. Now we understand that Jesus makes that journey to the Mount of Olives. He comes there, and in verse 1 of Matthew 24, he says, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to him, pointed out the temple building to him. So here he's been dealing with the priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of these individuals. And in essence saying, look guys, y'all are messing up. But he knew that it was too late. Just like was prophesied. And then he responds to the disciples pointing out the temple in verse 2 where he said, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. The temple was their anchor. It was their primary. It was what was important. And again, we go back to Daniel and how important the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple, was. And it was built. It was there in all of its glory. To make a statement like this to a Jewish person would have been taken in shock. How can Jesus say that this temple, this is our pride and glory, this is the greatest thing that we have, how is it going to be torn down? Well, we know that the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, Solomon's temple, and it was torn down. So they could have thought back to that and said, well, yeah, it can be torn down. It's just a building. But it was the utmost important building that they had. In the minds of virtually every first century Jew, the Messiah in their minds was to come and establish a glorious new kingdom. In Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 through 7, it says, "For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accompany this." They believed that God would send the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Eternal Father, the Prince of Peace, the Messiah. But in their minds, it was to be a physical kingdom. And remember, as Jesus is teaching all of these things here, the Jews are at war with Rome. They're in battle. They want to get rid of the Romans. So in their minds, even as we have noted, even in the disciples' minds, we're looking toward a physical kingdom. Sadly, in the minds of many today, they're still looking for this same thing. They believe that the kingdom surely would have its seat of government in the holy city, in Jerusalem. That Jerusalem must stand. In Isaiah 2, in verse 2, it says, "Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it." Well, truly, that is a reality, but not the way that they wanted to apply it. But in their minds, if the Messiah was to reign on the throne of David forever, its center of governmental power was to be in Jerusalem. And the temple had to be there. And to say that it was going to be destroyed would have been blasphemy. This same thinking is present in our world. Because there are things in the works today to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. I keep seeing it. And we'll talk about that whenever we get there. and we're going to talk about the red heifers. The red heifers today are in Israel, waiting for them to start rebuilding the temple, the third temple. That's what they're calling it, the third temple. So, for those that are looking to that, the third temple, these guys were sitting here scratching their heads and saying, what in the world? How can this be that this beautiful temple is going to be destroyed? I've talked about Flavius Josephus, and I'm going to take an excerpt out of the book Josephus' Jewish Wars 5:5:6, 5:5:6. And I encourage you, you can get this on Google or wherever, and you can go back and read this also. The temple was a magnificent thing. Herod had put everything to build this temple. It says here, and this is an excerpt from this, now the outward face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's mind or their eyes. It was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight. Josephus said that if the sun was gleaming off of all of this gold, this gold, that you couldn't even look at it. It'd be like looking at the sun. And that if you were far off and you were coming upon the Mount Moriah there, if you was coming up there where the temple is, that you could see it from a long, long, long way off. And then he notes also of its stones, some of them were 45 cubits in length, 5 in height, and 6 in breadth. These are huge stones weighing tons. And on the outside, these stones were white. So we think about the temple, and it was a magnificent edifice. It was just unreal. I mean, it didn't matter which way you came, you could see it for miles. And Jesus said, every stone will be torn down. That was his prophecy. And the disciples in their minds, and I want us to put ourselves in that place, thinking about a physical kingdom, thinking about why would this be torn down? Why is Jesus saying this? I mean, he's talked to the priest. We're out here on the Mount of Olives, and he's saying it's going to be torn down. And look at the glory of this place. And how are they going to destroy and move all of those stones? Well, in Josephus' Jewish Wars 5:4:4, that's kind of strange to me. It says, now as these towers were very tall, the largeness also of the stones was wonderful, for they were not made of common small stones. For of such large ones, such as men would carry, each stone was 20 cubits in length, 10 in depth, and 5 in depth. These stones that built the temple were huge. And the temple, when Herod come along, the temple, they expanded it near a little over double the Temple Mount, the whole thing there. Twice as big as it was. And then we think about the towers that adorned it, the protection of all of those things. And it notes in the Gospel of John, the 2nd chapter in verse 20, that it took 46 years to build the temple, and we're talking about Herod's part. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days? Because that's what Jesus says, I'm going to tear it down and I'm going to raise it up in 3 days. That was blasphemy, to do anything to the temple. The temple represented, in essence, God to the Jewish people. It was their connection with God. Now, Tacius is a historian, same time as Josephus. And in Tacius' Histories 5:11, he notes the city's defense. He writes here, he noted that the commanding situation of the city had been strengthened by enormous works, which would have been a thorough defense even on level ground. He went on to comment that 2 hills of great height were fenced in by walls, and within were other walls surrounding the palace, and rising to a conspicuous height, the Tower of Anthony. Now again, this is an excerpt. You could go back and you can Google Tacius Histories, and you can go back and read the whole section from this book of history. Remember, Josephus was a historian. Tacius is a historian. These writings are not inspired. They're just history, but important for us to understand. When we think about Jerusalem, it should have been easily defended militarily because it's high elevation. They had the upper ground and the height of the walls. We're talking 19 feet at least and thick. If you go back and watch the video that I've been noting about the siege of Jerusalem, it gives you more information along that line. Well, the disciples are scratching their heads. How could he say that? So they ask him a question. In verse 3 of Matthew 24, it says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us when these things happen, or when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, it's imperative to look at the parallels of this passage over in Luke 21 and Mark 13. So, in essence, they're bringing to light, when's this going to take place? What you've just said, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, he told them already, and he's going to tell them again. Back in Matthew 23 and verse 36, he says to the priest, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And we've talked a little bit about this already. And then you go down to chapter 24 and verse 34, and it says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So when we think about generation, if you look here at this is where we find the meaning of this passage. It says an age, a time ordinarily occupied, be each successive generation a space of 30 to 33 years. Some extended out to 40 years. In other words, I am considered a baby boomer. And I'm in the generation of the baby boomers. And I think the next bunch that's after us that was born in the 60s are the millennials. Is that right? I believe that's right. I can't keep up with it. They all say, is that right? Millennials? All right. Nobody else knows either. But it's my generation. He's talking about, if you will, let's back up. This generation. This generation. So while you guys are living in this generation, all these things are going to take place. Now I understand. There are those who want to redefine the word generation, gena, to mean hundreds or thousands of years. But in the original, it denotes this space of time, and let's say 30 to 40 years. A generation. So it was going to happen in their lifetime. Now, I want us to look at the question of the disciples. This is important. In Mark 13, in verse 4, it says, tell us when these things, or when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? Now, Mark is writing to a Gentile audience. So Jesus has talked about the temple being totally destroyed. Now, he's talking to folks out here in the world. So he's writing to Christians that are out here in the world. These people that weren't Jews, Gentiles, they might not have the concept of the importance of that temple thing that's down there on the mountain. However God dealt with them, he dealt with them. I don't know. I wished I did. I wish we had all that written down in Scripture, but it's not. I do know that people were living at the time right there around Jerusalem. I think of Cornelius and his family. They were Gentiles. Of course, he was kind of working with the Jews at the time. But they would not have had the concept as much as the Jews would, nor the sense of this place can't be destroyed. So they just ask, when's this going to happen? When's this going to be fulfilled? In Luke 21, verse 7, it says, they questioned him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are taking place? Well, again, Gentile audience, they want to know, when's this going to come about? When's this going to all be torn down? Now, when we get to Matthew 24, verse 3, Matthew is writing to the Jews, a Jewish audience. And that's why he uses the wording that he does that's just a little bit different because this is going to be a big deal to the Jews. Big deal to them. And he says, tell us when these things, I keep leaving out the will tonight. Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Well, when's this going to happen, Jesus? That second phrase, what will be the signs of your coming? It denotes the idea that Jesus is going to come in judgment on the children of Israel. Judgment is coming upon the children of Israel. He talked about it already in the parables that we looked at several weeks there. And the end of the age. Now, here's where we get a difficulty. And that's the word age. Now, some of your Bibles says at the end of the world. King James and the American Standard both use the word world in their translations. The New King James and the New American Standard use the word age. This is New American Standard here, 95 edition. That's what I use for these presentations. But the word age is important, or maybe we could say as important as the word generation. It is ion is the word that's used there. And it denotes a period of time or age. Now, we've talked about this a little bit, that from the Mount Sinai, when God gave the 10 Commandments, the law of Moses to Moses, that for the Jewish people, they were under the Mosaical dispensation or Mosaical age. And that come up to the cross. We're going to talk more about that, not tonight, but a later time. That age was fulfilled. And the old law was nailed to the cross. We're going to talk about that Sunday morning from Galatians chapter 5. So for the Jews, they should have understood that the age that Jesus is talking about was this age. It's going to be completed. Now remember, the church, the new covenant, had not come into being at the time that Jesus was on the Mount of Olives. It would soon come to pass, but it hadn't yet. And he notes here, and the end of the age. So when all of this is fulfilled, when Jesus dies on the cross, it's done. That's the end of the age. So we think about that passage right there. And it says, and he says, tell us when this is going to happen. What will be the sign of your coming? That's a coming in judgment. And when is it? At the end of the age. And the age came to an end at the cross. And again, let me reiterate. We're going to talk about the passage in Hebrews, Lord willing, Sunday morning. So, as I noted, Matthew wrote his gospel to a Jewish audience, and he likely recorded the questions as asked by the disciples who presumed that the destruction of the temple would mean his coming and the end of the age. So, what he said. The Jewish readers of the gospel would likely have the same conception. Mark and Luke wrote their gospels to Gentiles, and to avoid possible misunderstanding by non-Jewish readers, they worded the disciples' question to reflect what the discourse is actually about. So the passages in Mark and Luke more adequate for our understanding. It also notes here the destruction of the temple and the sign when its destruction would be imminent in this generation. And that's a very key thing. So, I understand there are those who have different ideas, but I would encourage every person to look at these passages, to go back and study them, look at the context. Look at what's going on. Think about the mindset of those that Jesus is speaking to. Look at the mindset of those in whom Mark and Luke are writing. You got to understand all of those things to get this. Now, Lord willing, next Wednesday we'll look at some of these signs and why did he list these? And he's got to be talking about, yes, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. Not something in the future, but something that's already taken place. So we'll start there next Wednesday evening.